is Joy. Joining me right now on set is the Senator for Mandera County. He's known as Senator Billow, who at one time he was a shadow finance minister and has been handling issues to do with finance for quite some time. I now want to get his views regarding this year's budget. Many thanks, Senator, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
A historic day for Kenya, biggest budget in the region. What are your thoughts around this year's budget?
Well, as always, our budget is a very ambitious budget. I think my main concern is a budget of 2.3 trillion shillings against a revenue of about 1.5 trillion. And that leaves a huge financing gap, close to almost 800 billion. So the question really is, shall we continue borrowing? We are heading towards 4 trillion. The last 3 years of this government, we have already done nearly 1.5 trillion in debt, and additional debt. So the question really is, do we need to continue expanding our budget? In other words, increasing our expenditures and expanding our public service when our debt levels have raised concerns now with IMF and with other institutions are raising concern about the level of borrowing by this country. I think that's a significant concern for me.
Speaking about debt, sorry to interrupt you, Senator, we are seeing debt has been sort of accumulating over time, and government is giving the narrative that this debt is going towards infrastructure, just trying to improve the business climate. But some feel like you that we're over-borrowing of sorts.
No, I think there is expenditure, of course, towards infrastructure like SGR and so forth. But when you look at the amount of money that is actually being spent, out of last year was 2.2 trillion. You are putting aside close to 600-700 for development, but ultimately what is spent on development is not more than 30-35%. That means you're spending about 200-300 billion on development out of a budget of 2 trillion if you remove what goes to the county government. So that's the same questions that have been raised on Eurobond. I mean, how much of the money actually goes into infrastructure is a concern. It doesn't, because the level of absorption of the development budget has been a concern for many years. We've never gone beyond a 50% absorption rate in this country on our development budgets. Last December, for the 6 months, we have done 23% only absorption, and it's highly unlikely, that this by now it will reach more even 50% of the. So we are not really doing very well on that. But otherwise, if we were borrowing specifically to go into productive, investments in infrastructure and so forth, then we would see the return immediately, then it would lead to growth of the economy and so forth. But it's clear that most of our expenditure is really on consumption, really, even when we borrow, quite a significant part of it.
All right. Of course, we are borrowing more than we need. But the bigger question is, what sort of tax measures are we likely to see coming out of this year's budget?
I don't think the minister would be inclined to introduce new taxes, especially just before the elections. It's highly unlikely. Last year they reviewed the VAT rates and brought many other transactions into the VAT bracket. So I don't think they will be taking that route again. It would be too much. I think what the minister also does not tell you is that the projected 1.3 trillion revenue collections by KRA is likely to be a dream, because even this year, by June this year, KRA is already below target by close to 100 billion. They're not doing pretty well. So I think it's a wishful budget that you'll collect 1.3 trillion in revenue. Is highly unlikely that you would. Probably what they will do, if at all they will introduce, is probably on areas, like alcohol and the usual areas like betting, and this they would be tempted to introduce new taxes, especially when concerns have been explained on the living standards of Kenyans. People really having difficult times. It would not make sense, and I doubt whether the minister would introduce new taxes on essential commodities and this kind of thing. I don't think so.
Senator, of course, we're seeing KRA being on the spotlight here. They've been missing the targets year in, year out. What perhaps needs to be done differently? Because if you look at other countries, we are seeing the level of revenue being generated through taxes is quite significant. Do we foresee a situation where Kenya at one point will be able to hit its revenue targets and even get to a surplus condition?
I think it's unlikely unless we deal with corruption, because what is happening is there is corruption inside KRA. So that the collection of revenue in customs duties and other taxes have been affected. That's why generally the performance of KRA has been getting poorer. It's not the way it has been, and I think I've said this many times. And the ministry is not really dealing with this matter seriously. Last year they announced a budget in the same time in June. 2 months later there was a severe cash crunch in the country. They couldn't pay salaries. Money cannot be transferred to county governments. There was a serious, ministries were stranded, serious cash crisis, you remember. 2 months after approving a budget. So it clearly shows that then they had not looked at those revenue numbers, and they said, revenues were off target. I mean, when you bring a budget to the House, one would expect that you have looked at your projections carefully, very carefully, to ensure that these are actually, and their measures, their plans to actually achieve those targets. But if numbers are done, to kill it, just to show that, look, we are making progress and we are going to get more, and you know that year on year you're falling below targets. I think it doesn't make sense, and I think we need to be rational in our projections, and we need to be rational in our expenditures, so that we don't just get into a borrow and spend culture. Really, I think it doesn't. But I think there's need to deal with corruption. I think the question of merely vetting some senior officers in KRA, as the president directed a few months ago, would not help. I think there's need to completely, radically review the management of KRA and review even the legal basis, because it used to be that the commissioners, individual commissioners of KRA, had powers that were relevant to those particular. The VAT commissioner was in charge of VAT, but now you have a situation where the director general has all the powers. I think there's really need to look at the entire structure and address the concerns on KRA.
Many thanks. There are quite significant issues being raised by Senator Billow Kerrow, who will be speaking to him later on after the budget to just hear what he thinks of some of the measures that the Kenya government will be considering to finance the ambitious budget of 2.3 trillion Kenya shillings. From this end, my name is Abi Agina. Let's touch base at about 2 p.m. to give you more coverage from Parliament.